A lot of people ask why we're always emphasizing a thing called conservation financing when it comes to the protection of old growth forests in British Columbia. And they want to know what exactly is conservation financing. Okay, before I explain that, it's important to realize that in British Columbia, the BC government can't unilaterally just save the old growth forests. This is a thing that the vast majority of BC environmentalists even don't understand. The fact is that successive court rulings have shown that because these are the unceded territories of First Nations, meaning that the First Nations across the vast majority of the province never gave up their lands here, that First Nations consent and support is vital for any legislated land use change like new protected areas. The First Nations have got to want to save the old growth forests in their territories if the government is going to be able to legislate protection for them. Now, all across BC, there's a high level of dependency economically on timber industry jobs and revenues in First Nations communities, and that includes in old growth. And so there's no viable, reasonable path for First Nations to be able to protect a lot of the forests, including the old growth, in their territories unless there is alternative funding so that they don't have to basically flee their main source of revenues and jobs, which no human population would do unless there's an alternative. And because successive governments have facilitated and fostered that high level of economic dependency on forestry jobs, including in old growth logging, we say that the BC government and the federal government, as well as support from the conservation community, is vital for First Nations to then move forward with Indigenous protected and conserved areas, typically legislated through provincial conservancies in British Columbia. And so the BC government, because we've specifically defined that as an issue with First Nations allies, is now moving forward with developing a conservation financing mechanism for First Nations. And there's a whole lot of federal funding and provincial funding coming together, and they're going to be announcing this fall. But there's still a way this can go wrong. Because of the old dinosaur mindsets, particularly within the Ministry of Forests and in some of the cabinet, there's efforts to try to figure out ways to kind of stymie this whole thing while it still moves forward by the more environmental and progressive wings within the government as well. I suspect Eby's probably on the more environmental side, but we'll see where it all lands. He's in charge. And so they may be trying to make conservation financing primarily about First Nations capacity land use planning needs, which is an important need, as well as data collection and monitoring and enforcement and stewardship jobs, but not about funding First Nations-owned sustainable businesses as an alternative to the timber jobs and revenues. First Nations-owned businesses in tourism, clean energy, sustainable seafood, non-timber forest products, value-added second growth forestry are vital to fund, linked to ecosystem-based targets, protection targets for the productive old growth forests. If they create a conservation financing mechanism that doesn't fund the economy, then the big driver that prohibits new protected areas is still there. And if they don't link it to ecosystem-based targets to save the most at-risk old growth, then you get Indigenous protected areas that skirt around the valuable timber, which will still get logged. So those are the two key things: ecosystem-based targets for the most at-risk old growth and funding for economic development as alternatives. If the government does that to support First Nations communities, then I say that the grandest ecosystems and forests are going to be protected.